Hi, welcome back. So today I want to just touch upon a topic that's very interesting in my opinion, and that topic is epigenetics. Okay. And now I've remembered my little microphone today, but the room is still echoey. Can't do anything about that. Hopefully the mic helps alleviate a little bit of the poor audio, but it still is what it is. And yeah, you're welcome. So, epigenetics are really cool. It's when the phenotypic expression of a trait is meaningfully and stably altered without altering the DNA sequence itself. Right? And so the phenotype works semi-independently of the genotype. Right? And so you can have one genotype, but ultimately express several different variations of that phenotype depending upon environmental conditions. Okay. Now, this change in phenotype, right, the flexibility in phenotype is called phenotypic plasticity. Right? And having this phenotypic plasticity allows for a lot more adaptive offspring. Right? So if you can have one genotype in your baby, but have it be 4 or 5 different phenotypes, depending on what the area around you is like, obviously that's going to vastly improve the survivability of your genome, of your offspring, of your species as a whole, right? And so you're much more likely to be able to provide a continuation, a perpetuation of your gene line, right? If you have this plasticity of phenotypes. And so once this plasticity shows up, it's rare for it to disappear, right? It has a lot of natural selection benefits. Now, we already have met one of these mechanisms of epigenetic regulation in our studies. Okay? So when we talked about DNA methylation patterns that can turn on or turn off genes in an entire cell line, that is a form of epigenetics. Right? So we already have an idea about how this works. Some examples from our own personal lives, right? A really easy one to see is tanning, right? And so depending upon your exposure to ultraviolet light from the sun, your phenotypic expression for skin tone can change. Right? And so if we're exposed to UV light, our gene expression for melanin can be increased if we have the right genotypes. Right? And so we have that phenotypic plasticity by UV exposure. Right? Like if you're like me, like I don't know how to tan. Like my body is like, no, we ain't gonna do that. Right? I burn, and then I get back to being pale. And then I burn, and I go back to being pale. Those are my two options. Right? And burning is not a phenotype. So I don't have that plasticity. Right? I lack that, what's the right word? What's the word I'm looking for? Flexibility, variety, versatility. I lack that versatility. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay. Another one that half of us are very familiar with, well, you probably don't know what's going on, but it's happening in your body right now. If you are a female, right, and you have 2 copies of the X chromosome, in all of your cells, one of those X's is shut off. Right? And which X is shut off is random. Right? And so in cell A, you might have your father's X turned on and your mother's X turned off. But in cell D, you might have the inverse. You have your mother's X turned on and your father's X turned off. Okay? And so as a cumulative whole, you have both of your X's expressed, but in any individual cell, one of your X's is turned off. We call that a Barbody, right? That dormant X. Okay? Some really interesting epigenetic traits come down to what's called a maternal effect trait. Right? And these are really cool because it's not the offspring's own genotype that is determining its phenotype. It's the genotype of the mother determines the phenotype of the offspring. Right? So one of these examples that always comes up is the curly Q shape of the snail shell, right? Whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise is determined by the mother of that snail's genotype for which clockwise or anti-clockwise shell it has, right? And so it's not the snail's own genotype. It's the mother's genotype that controls what shape shell he has. Okay. And now, typically, these maternal effect genes work through either cytoplasmic determinants, which are molecules in the egg cell that the mother donates to this baby's existence, right? Or through maternal RNA, also found in the egg cell. Right? And so during those very, very, very important first developmental steps, the conditions that are regulating what genes are getting turned on and what genes are getting turned off are environmentally sensitive, right? And the environment that we're dealing with when we are just a zygote is the egg that the mother donated, right? So like all of the stuff inside the egg that's surrounding the DNA, that all came from the mother. Right? And so these maternal effect genes are really interesting in that way. Right? So one of the really cool implications of this idea is that the traits of a child can be determined by the experiences of a mother's life, right? And so to take this to an extreme, this is not going to be a real example, this is an absurd extreme example, right? If there was a gene that turned on through the exposure to Coca-Cola, right? Maybe the Coca-Cola digestion gene gets turned on. If your mother has ever had Coca-Cola in her life, that exposure to Coca-Cola would turn on her gene for Coca-Cola digestion, right? And that could perpetuate itself, right? And her RNA would end up in the egg that would make you, and therefore you would have the expressed Coca-Cola digestion gene because your mother was exposed to Coca-Cola when she was 12 years old, right? Now, if she had never been exposed to Coca-Cola, you don't have that gene turned on. Right? Super interesting implications. Right? So the field of epigenetics is still really, really young, very nascent field. Right? And so there are a lot of theories about the developmental impact of epigenetics, right? And so like some of the theories are things like if you leave your child to cry for too long when they're small, they will develop personality traits when they're older, being insecure and not being confident because of epigenetic traits being turned on and turned off. Right? And again, that's still really nascent. So like all the theories that you can find in that regard are still not like super supported, right? But they are very, very, very interesting. It comes back to that very traditional nurture versus nature argument of are traits genetic? Like, is our personality genetic or is it environmental, right? And most reasonable people come to the conclusion that it's a combination of both, right? This idea of epigenetics puts that compromise back into the genetic side of things. Like we're still talking about genetic expression, right? So that compromise isn't just this wishy-washy thing. It's real, like it's a physical activity that's happening on our DNA regulation, right? And so the environment is directly impacting the genetics. And so it's both nature and nurture very literally, right? So very fun stuff. An example that I had listed out but didn't talk about yet, which was also really cool. So insects, right? There are some species of insects that when the mother is exposed to adverse environmental conditions, maybe there's not a lot of food, right? Maybe there's too many bugs around, like there's too many, it's overpopulated, okay? This maternal effect can have the offspring be born with the phenotype expression of wings when typically they would be born without wings, right? And that gives them the ability to fly off and get out of here, right? So that's really cool. Like all of a sudden, like this whole generation of insect that now has wings because the area was really bad, right? And that's super awesome. Like being able to adapt your physical traits by what your environment is amazing. And it's something that kind of goes against the traditional view of how genetics work, right? We typically think it's kind of like set. Once you have your genes, you have them. But as we study this new field more and more, we find that that's not necessarily true. Right? So not all maternal effects are environmentally related, right? Like just what your mother's genotype is can determine the methylation patterns of your genes and what you have turned on and turned off. And so your personal genotype doesn't necessarily matter as much as what your mother's genotype was and what methylation patterns she inspired to be produced in your eggs. Right? And again, back to the whole developmental aspect of this, there's a very high probability that these kinds of mechanisms are involved in those traits that have a genetic predisposition, but not determination, right? And so things like addiction and depression and cancer, where you can see that they run in families, and you have this higher probability of having one of these conditions if you have family members who also have it, right? Like if your father's an alcoholic, you have a much higher chance of being an alcoholic yourself than if your father's not, right? And it brings it back to that debate that I just mentioned, the nurture versus nature, right? And we're finding that that epigenetic nature of things, right, leads it to be like the environment can turn on a genotype that you have. So you might have a genotype that is predisposed to addictive tendencies, right? And so your reward punishment chemical system in your brain hole is a little bit skewed from what the typical reward system is, right? And so maybe you're more easily dependent upon dopamine releases, right? And that's a genotypic expression, but until you get the environmental factors that turn on or turn off those genes that are regulating this dopamine issue, then you don't get it expressed as a phenotype. So yeah, again, just a really cool field of study. A lot of really cool implications upon how genetics actually present in the real world and how we become what we are as human beings, as bunny beings, as bee beings, right? As living things, and how our traits come about as a collective whole. That's it. Cool. Bye.